Looks like it's you and me. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm good. So what do you think about free will and determinism? What are your thoughts after it? So everyone, we're doing this class on Ivan Illich, and we just talked about free will and determinism and how if you just look at a single vector of reality, like biology to biology, it looks like determinism is true. If you just do chemistry to chemistry, it looks like determinism is true, and how you need to think more situationally and up the stack. So we were talking about determinism and free will. Do you have any thoughts, or what else are you thinking about, Michelle, in general?
I think that, we just prepared a lecture for the Ivan Illich class on determinism and freedom. And I think it's a pretty consequential topic. And it's also can feel a bit like, I suppose that perhaps with determinism, that being that everything is kind of determined in reality, right? That it sort of seems like, well, of course, if that's kind of the viewpoint you hold, then it sort of seems obvious and kind of would be, though, that if somebody doesn't feel it is that way, that they feel just as much like, well, that's obviously not true, though, because, look, I make choices and I feel like my freedom is compromised in these certain ways or whatever. So I guess what I mean to say is like both can be almost a type of ideological position, right? What can kind of keep it tempered to understanding the necessity of both or the relation between both? I mean, obviously, as we talked about, it gets into like it being very situational. But yeah, what are your thoughts, Daniel?
Well, I mean, again, in order to prove determinism, like there's an assumption of space-time, that time is relative to space versus time-space. And that Lee Smoller guy does all that amazing work on how time is probably fundamental. And I mean, right now, in order to keep space-time as most fundamental, you have to posit multiverses and all these other different things. So there's very good reason to think that our assumption about time being basically an illusion is false. And yet, when it comes to the debate of free will and determinism, that's not considered. But if indeed time is fundamental, then there is freedom to some degree. There is indeterminacy, right? And you also, with Gödel, can't have a complete system that doesn't entail indeterminacy. So I think a lot of the debate that's trapped between freedom, like free will, and determinism assumes scientific backgrounds that may not be given. And it is very consequential. But that all aside, I'd be curious of what you think about this. Could you make an argument purely on, let's say, the evidence was equal for determinism, scientifically, philosophically, whatever, and the evidence was equally in favor of freedom? What would be the reasons to choose freedom over determinism, right? Because, like, what are the practical consequences of these belief systems? Now, Sam Harris, in his book Free Will, kind of argues that determinism might make us more merciful, might make us kinder, because when people screw up, we're not going to go, oh, it was their fault, they chose that. He makes the example of, at the beginning of his book, of someone who commits murder, but it's like, well, what if they had a brain tumor? Shouldn't you be more compassionate, right? That's why they were acting that way. So there's this kind of notion that determinism could make more compassion. But then there's also plenty of studies that show that when people believe in determinism, they're more likely to do immoral things or cheats on tests or stuff like that. So what do we think are the practical ramifications between determinism and freedom and those different kind of arguments in that way?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I think that that's fascinating. And I think obviously, I think when compassion can be cultivated, that tends to be beneficial, right? Now, if there's compassion with no justice or compassion with no understanding of the cost that is involved in, say, forgiveness, then it can be, which obviously, some would say, well, forgiveness isn't calculated, right? That's the whole point. It's something you could never really. But the thing is that even if forgiveness is, let's say, for there's that quote from Derrida, I think it was Derrida, who said, it's forgiveness is for the unforgivable, right? Which is a really beautiful and transformative concept. There is still, from a phenomenological experience, a type of cost that requires, and in the sense that it takes a lot of either letting go, or yes, that's fine, darling, or it takes a lot of it takes a lot of the person in their cultivation to be able to do something like that,
Right.
The whole point of why that's so meaningful requires, I feel like it does require quite a bit from the person in terms of, and now the whole point is that they don't they don't calculate it, not because it doesn't exist, but because they choose not to calculate it, right? Like they choose not to think about, oh, how much does this cost me in terms of my my emotional effort in terms of having to do this, which doesn't feel possible, but I'm going to do it anyway, sort of thing. So anyways, I just wanted to speak to that, the idea of like a cost in forgiveness. That's not to, I'm not trying to say, the whole point is that there is something that one could think about in terms of what does that sort of require, but what's the point of forgiveness, but to sort of say, it doesn't matter that cost, right? It's kind of a choosing for it to be an calculated thing phenomenologically. So anyways, but the point of the matter is, I think that when it comes to compassion, the idea of determination, well, the thing is that it seems to be like that could work pretty well in terms of retroactively, but how does determinism prevent anything? Like we do want to prevent murder, don't we? Like we can kind of try to make it okay. It's not okay, but we can kind of have place for compassion in it after the fact, right? But there's also a way in which it's all like in the abstraction of it, it's seems like in a way we can kind of again retroactively make some sort of a way to see that as being compassionate, because maybe the person can control themselves, but we wouldn't really say that it's just okay that somebody we love dearly or we want to protect is murdered, right? We know that's not something we would just say, yeah, that's fine. It's not fine, right? In the sense that we don't want it to happen. So I don't know that determinism does much in the way of like of providing the means by which to prevent certain things, because again, you wouldn't be able to prevent it if it's determined. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So anyways, yeah, I think about that. That's why I think there could be a better case for freedom in the sense that if there's anything that we would potentially try to prevent, even if we fail at it, even just the sense of being able to attempt that, or if there's something we'd want to prevent somebody from slashing our tires. Well, why do we want them to prevent? Why do we want to prevent that? I feel like it breaks things down a lot really fast. Like, because how could you couldn't really have any really sense of what would be okay to do and not okay to do, because if it's all determined anyway, then it doesn't really matter. So I think that's like the potential experiential pitfalls of determinism. But at the same time, I understand. I think again, it's great to have compassion, but we also have to think about, well, how does that work in a functioning society in terms of the pre element? Maybe retroactively it could work, but the pre element, and I think by its form, determinism has to work that way because it's always retroactively that you can't change things, right? But the thing you can change is your own perspective to that, right? That's why like story work can be very important in terms of actually working through one's trauma. Why does anyone do that? They can't change that it happened, right? But it's about how you can maybe change your orientation to it, or your acceptance of it, or your letting go of it, or whatever it is. So anyways, I just think there's something about like we could kind of challenge the concept of prevention or improvement or these things, but on a practical level, we do attempt them, even if we don't realize it. Like we eat something because we're hungry, and if we start to not feel very good, right? So anyways, those are my thoughts.
Oh yeah, and Jacob, Kishere, Javier, good to see you. We're talking about freedom versus determinism. We just did a recording for the Ivan Illich class that Mr. Kishere is in. That's kind of a lot on that topic. And we were just discussing what are the practical benefits of determinism, what's the practical benefits of freedom. Sam Harris at the beginning of his book says determinism could actually make us more compassionate. Because if you realize the guy that carries out the terrible crime may be a criminal because of factors outside of their control, you might be less vengeful, you might be a more compassionate people. So determinism could actually create more mercy. But then on the flip side, determinism seems to empty out all moral categories, right? Like if there's no freedom, then nothing seems to mean anything. So in the lecture we just gave, we try to go through actually like how, for example, a lot of determinism assumes space-time as the fundamental reality, fundamental basis of reality. But if actually time-space is the fundamental basis of reality, that would not so follow. And honestly, very often the debate between like freedom and determinism seems to just be an emphasis debate. Like who wants to emphasize determinism? Oh, determinism and fatalism are not the same thing. I think like Sam Harris basically says that, and you go, okay, then what is it exactly? It seems to just be an emphasis debate. So what are the practical benefits of determinism and freedom? And the final thing I'll say, it makes me think, Michelle, what you're saying is that freedom requires forgiveness as a social structure. Like if you have a free society, but that society has no doctrine of forgiveness, Well, then it seems like determinism is better because then you can have grace, right? Or like mercy. But the problem is the determinism can't deal with the preemptive. So it would seem like to deal with the preemptive, you need forgiveness. But what do you do today when forgiveness seems to be injustice? Like if you forgive someone, you're enabling the injustice, as we've talked about before. It's very interesting to think that maybe there's some strong social link between the possibility of freedom and the possibility of forgiveness. And if you have a society where forgiveness is not possible or there's no coherent doctrine of forgiveness, then does that mean you can't actually have freedom? Because that would seem like what, or socially cannot have. I'd be curious how anyone responds to that. Because now
it's compassion, because then you think to yourself, well, maybe that guy murdered because he had a brain tumor, right? That's the example, right? And that, again, that there's something very beautiful about that in the sense of having this type of grace, right? There's maybe more than meets the eye that's going on for why that would have occurred or why they would have done that, right? So that's important. But I want to say that I wonder if even the ability to have compassion is in itself an act of freedom. And what I mean to say is, like, what would one typically do, right? If it's somebody they actually genuinely cared about and they were murdered, they would have grief, they would have sadness, they would have all of the emotions that come with devastation potentially. So, and there would be a sense of, why did that guy do that, right? Like, why, or why did it have to be that way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, maybe determinism is like, here, now we have an answer to all of your tormenting questions of why did it have to be that way. It was just determined to be that way, right? Like, so in a way I can understand that, right? But there's also a way in which the fact that one would have compassion would require them to do something that is counter to like a typical causality with, you know, and now you could say, well, it's not typical causality to be grieving somebody you love who's murdered. I don't know. Practically speaking, people do this. This is what typically occurs because you care and you have had many years with a person in a bond, and it's a complete change. It doesn't mean that grief won't also come with transformation and healing and positive feelings of all of the memories you have with them. But essentially, there will be a sense of that felt unfair or maybe unjust. So to be compassionate is to do something that is, I guess what I mean to say is, it seems like it would require freedom to do that, right? Unless you want to say that it can be determined that you can be compassionate. So then to me, it would kind of come down to like, well, what actually typically happens in people's lives, or when these situations happen, what usually happens. And now that's hard because we can't see into people's minds. So we can't really say what exactly they're thinking or how exactly they're experiencing the thing, right? But yeah, I don't know. I wonder what everyone else thinks. Like, is there freedom that's required, or at least some degree of freedom that's required in having compassion?
Very much. Well, just lovely to see you both too. And yeah, jumping in on this call and onto the theme of forgiveness, I immediately felt like, this is like a deeply relevant and therefore slightly synchronistic thread for me to jump on with the two of you. And it does strike me as a really free act, because in some sense, when somebody's family member is murdered or something like that, then they the more deterministic path seems to be that they hold the grief or the vengeance or whatever it is forever. The free act, the radical act, is the forgiveness. And this is what really interests me. And I've had many instances over the years of people in those situations who somehow undergo a flip. And I'm really interested in, like, what is the crux of that? What's really going on there when somebody undergoes a true act of forgiveness? Because it's not undoing the wrongdoing, I suppose. It's not undoing the sense of wrongdoing that the victim or party holds in that situation. So what's happening there, and why do people feel actually like empowered by that? Like, they seem to feel like they've actually taken back a degree of agency and power, and that the non-forgiveness is a kind of attachment and giving over of power to the to the other party or to the situation. And this can happen on like long time scales. Like, people can have this happen after 60 years with a school teacher that molested them or something when they were a kid, or it can be, you know, much shorter term. So yeah, this is just a fascinating phenomenon for me, beyond whether it's determined or freely enacted. But I think it is free. I think there's some spiritual alchemy in that moment.
That's a lovely comment. I'll give it to Javier. It's almost like if forgiveness is the impossible in that Derrida sense, are we human to the degree we attempt the impossible? Is there something about the impossible that is where we find our humanity? And what maybe there's something about forgiveness where it's precisely like something happened to you, and then the logical response would be anger. And the power comes from giving a middle finger to cause and effect. You're like, I'm not going to be bound by causality. I'm actually going to make choices. And there's some sort of like, take that causation. That might be an empowerment. But then in other times, maybe you forgive because you're too weak to hold on to the anger. Maybe someone could spin it that way and say, well, actually, you're forgiving because you're too weak to hold on to the righteous anger, right? It's funny how we can like spin these things so much, but maybe the power is the willingness to face that possible misinterpretation of your actions. There's a power in facing the fear of being misunderstood, right? So it's interesting to think of all those layers. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Javier Rivera, I hope you are doing well today, sir.
Yeah, hi guys, this is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I see two avenues, maybe two false avenues, but I guess when we talk about practicality, we're talking about the fact that we have to live in a society and therefore, you know, have to sort of, you know, make a cohesive society, a functional society. So I think if we limit ethics to this, then of course, determinism runs into some issues. You know, I always enjoy like the little studies about like, oh, people figured out that everything's deterministic, so they started cheating more, right? Something like that. I always love those studies, mainly because, well, it's kind of funny because then if we take Nietzsche seriously, it's a subject that determines itself. And so we follow into a couple of things. I mean, I am sympathetic to the argument of determinism where they talk about, you know, it leaves room for compassion. But the problem that Michelle brought up raises a couple of issues in terms of like, for example, how did we learn what compassion is? Where did that come from? It seems we all have sort of different conceptions of what that is. So arguably one could say, oh, those are deterministic forces from which you use the concept of compassion to give compassion to another, right? That's still an open question as to what compassion actually means, because we all have some kind of concept of like, this is me doing something, an act that is compassion, that is forgiving, that is of my own volition, and so on. So there's that issue, but so, I mean, I think if I were to give determinism its like clarity, I would say free will is a necessary delusion to live in a deterministic world, right? Because the moment you accept determinism, well, it seems to not, all of a sudden everything switches causality wise. People start doing the opposite, right? Oh, it doesn't matter, so blah, 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 blah. So there is something you could almost say deterministic about the belief in freedom and free will, to which is necessary, which most people don't argue about. And again, because we live in a society and there's other people, we have moral issues and moral ethics that we have to confine society to and its limits. So every time this conversation gets brought up, it always comes down to the limit of a society, ethical norms and moral convention and everything, which is fine. Those are the issues that must be raised. And that's why freedom is always an important topic to talk about, because it seems to be the necessary function for society. Because if not, then people seem to just ironically do the opposite. So regardless of whether it is actually an illusion or not, or determined, it seems to be a necessary function. But there's something that Jacob brushed on, which was there's an other side to this avenue where we exceed the social limits and necessities, to which now we're talking about ethics and forgiveness. And I think there is a spiritual side to this all, which exceed the capacity of moral and social constraints, you could say, that the fact that you need to make a society work, that we need. I mean, the funny thing about Derrida's quote is Derrida also acknowledges that we have to calculate, right? We have to. It's part of the process of reconciliation. Now, he comes up with this concept of pure forgiveness, but he also understands that it's necessary to calculate. Just like Buber acknowledges that it's necessary that we live in a world of I and it. It's not that it's bad. The only time that it becomes bad is if we take it as all that it is. And I think Derrida would say something similar. It only becomes bad if all we take is calculation is all that it is. So the threat that happens when we're coming across the question of ethics, forgiveness, everything else, social constraints, how do we follow? How do we deal with somebody that murdered, knowing they're deterministic or not, or whatever? These are all calculative functions that we're trying to sort through, calculative problems that we're trying to figure out through. Those are constraints. I admit, those are necessary constraints. However, there's another conversation on the background, meaning like, is there a way that human beings can also live beyond those constraints spiritually, right? So there seems to be like this thing where it's like, yes, the man did wrong, even if his unconscious, deterministic, whatever, he still goes to jail, right? That's just part of the ethical implications. But the spiritual implications are what? That he's forgiven, he can still be saved, so on, something like that, So there is a beyondness to the social constraints that, deprive ethics of its full value. There is this point where it does, in some sense, go beyond good and evil. There is that sense, but we always have to restrain that sense because, again, it doesn't make sense because you're living in a society and you must cohere and there's necessities and there's functions. And even if we have moral or philosophical qualms, it still doesn't take away the fact that we live in a society and these are necessary. So it becomes very problematic when we confine either forgiveness to a necessity of social cohesion and then forgiveness beyond the necessity of social cohesion and how that. And I think Derrida was trying to envision both. How can we look at forgiveness beyond social constraints, beyond the impossible? And I think when we are talking about the impossible, it's probably a more spiritual realm. Maybe the question is, how can we feedback? How can we use that as a feedback loop to enrich and rethink our ethical and societal constraints when we judge human beings, despite the necessity that they may still have to go to jail or be put to death or whatever. I mean, there's so many factors that go into this. The law system, the fact that 50% of people in jail have mental illness. I mean, there's just so many factors, but also how can we use it to enrich? But yeah, I'll
The question on what
Yeah.
you were saying, this kind of distinction, and I really feel like you've taken the forgiveness point kind of beyond where I took it. So I appreciate that. We're in a new place with it. This distinction of the forgiveness and the calculation, could you kind of clarify what the calculation is? And maybe Daniel, you have a thought on this. Is that something like discernment? Is that...
I can elaborate on that, Jacob.
Yeah.
So the way Derrida talks about it is he calls it reconciliation. Okay, he doesn't call it pure forgiveness, but reconciliation is kind of like, okay, this person did me wrong, but he's my family member, so I kind of need this family to work and be together, so I'm going to forgive him. That's one method of reconciliation, right? And then there's another method of reconciliation, which is more ego entwined. Derrida talks about this too, where it's like, well, it doesn't do me well to constantly hate and spite this person because he already did it. Nothing can change. So it's better just to forgive him, right? Because again, nothing's going to change after this. It's just better to do it. That's what Derrida would call reconciliation. because you were trying to reconcile what was done and try to match it with some type of like either ego compensation or some type of calculation to be like, okay, this is my reason. And you could say it's a discernment, because I would say it is, at the end of the day, a judgment. This is my reason for forgiving you. I finally can do this. Now, again, Derrida says that's perfectly fine and well. It is a necessary thing. But when we start thinking about more impossible avenues that exceed calculation, that are just impossible to forgive, I think that's when Derrida starts to challenge us a little bit more on this. Because should we always live in a realm where we're always calculating our forgiveness? That's a question to ask ourselves. And I think that's where it kind of exceeds. And that's why I think Derrida talks about it and speaks about it like, this is my conception of pure forgiveness. Where he demolishes the opposite. He strips away the binary. The unforgivable is for forgiveness. There you go. He strips it out. Can we do that? That's another thing. But to me, that couldn't, because there's social constraints, it is impossible when you have systems of law, other forces, political. It has everything to do, in my opinion, with the more spiritual and subjective life. But it can feed back into an influence. Maybe we can change society for that reason. But anyways, yeah, I'll leave it there. Hopefully that clarifies, Jacob.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that was excellent, Javier. And a few things come to mind. So one of the reasons I kind of really like the topic of forgiveness is precisely because it unveils. So in the past, if you believed in Jesus, you almost had, like, you could say, two dimensions. We'll say spiritual dimension and the worldly dimension, where even if you believed that the world was determined, bondage of the will, whatever, you still had a spiritual reality for freedom, so you could have both. Kind of an interplay between determinism and freedom, right? But as the death of God occurred, and you only had one dimension, the finite, you have two principles that, although they could be worked out when put against different logical systems, because they were located in different ontological spaces, now they're on the same dimension, and they seem to contradict, and they don't seem to work together very well. So determinism and freedom has created that problem, where when you believe, like if you believed in God, you could figure out how even if we're somehow determined in this life, actually determinism doesn't have to equal fate. Like some religions make distinctions between destiny and fate, where you could actually kind of carve out a space for agency precisely because there were two ontological planes. But now there's only one. So you find all these kind of problems that are arising that you have to, how do you think that? How do you do that? Forgiveness is the same way too, because even like if someone did something unforgivable to you, and the great book Embrace and Exclusion by Mikhail Wolf will talk about this, is like you had people, in the Balkans where tribes would invade other tribes and killed their children and whatever, and all these horrible things. And the reason why the people were able to not just get stuck in endless cycles of revenge is because they were like, well, if the other tribe is truly evil, God will judge them in the end. And so I can reconcile with them and it not be an insult to the memory of my children. You see how you were able to do that double logic move where you say, well, because there's a judgment day, if those people are evil, it's not up to me then to bring about the judgment. And so I myself cannot carry out the judgment and not be saying and not be a coward, or not be saying it's okay that the tribe invaded mine, right? And what's so interesting is Mikhail Wolf basically says that the doctrine of hell was actually a great source of peace then. Like, it's very counterintuitive to what we usually think. It's like, because people are like, oh, there actually is justice, it's not up to me to carry out justice. And in fact, I can reconcile myself with the neighbor. And then if the person truly is evil, then God will take care of it. But we can't think in that. It's very difficult to think in those terms of those double logics, if you will, if you don't believe in God. And so that creates all sorts of different issues. But I'll touch on, and then I'll give it to Michelle. What I'm very interested in is this notion of society being the place of calculation. So you were talking about, for Derrida, the forgiveness of the impossible. Well, what's very interesting is when you believed in God, there could, at least in the society, had a belief in God. If the impossible entered the society, there may have been a double logic that could have dealt with it. And I wonder where, if now, because you don't have those double dimensions to have more kind of interconnected logics, then society can only allow calculatable forgiveness, forgiveness that we can calculate. And then it has to do everything in its power to keep out the impossible. Because if the impossible entered the society, that the society would then have to interact with, because it could not calculate it, it could be a threat to the entire logic of the social order and therefore the legitimacy of the social order. And so it actually has to create mechanisms of keeping the impossible out so that everything that occurs within it is calculatable, so that it looks like the society can handle whatever is thrown at it, and it has a logic for whatever is thrown at it, so it maintains its legitimacy. And what that means is that because then the impossible, if it enters the society and unveils the inadequacy of the social logic, it would almost be like a virus that could spread through the social order and overturn logics everywhere. And I wonder if there's almost this way then where society has to make sure that the impossible scenario doesn't enter into it. Because if it does, that could overturn everything. And actually, I think that's already happened, right? Like people are like, and that's why forgiveness is so tricky, because you have had people that have done terrible things, and there seems to be no calculatable reason to deal with it, no calculatable forgiveness for that. So how do you deal with it? Well, you come up with determinism. You say, well, then it's because determinism is true. But wait a minute, that seems to have unintentional consequences. So then you flip to freedom. And then when you deal with that, you have like maybe not enough grace, and you flip back and forth. And so like an impossible contradiction has arisen in the society because the impossible has already occurred in it. And now that leads to all these kind of tensions and problems that we don't know how to deal with it because the society was not able to keep out the uncalculatable. It's just a matter of time before it gets in there. I'm thinking about that relation between society, calculation, and impossible, because that's very curious to me, but I will give it to Michelle. Michelle, please.
It's interesting how you said we could accept that this is like, let's just say Christian theology, Satan's the Lord of the age. So the world itself is kind of fallen, but we understand there's this freedom in Christ and that's the higher vertical dimension. What I'm fascinated by is how that can also kind of flip around though, where perhaps because of resentments or failures of church or whatever it is, that there can be this idea of like, well, actually that higher principle is what made me feel so determined, right? I had to be, I was determined to heaven, I was determined to hell, I was determined, blah, blah, blah. And so then what happens is like to get to kind of as a reaction, there's a freedom sought in the world, right? I'll just be, that made me feel so determined. So now I'm just going to like relinquish myself from that and I will be in freedom, right? Now, what's interesting is that over time, what we've seen is that seems to ultimately be that you're free to choose determinism, right? Like your paper talks about, like ultimately people seem to want to choose determinism. We can even just think about it, like you said, Sam Harris, there's a lot of scientifically this concept of like, well, we couldn't really help it. And there's a real reality to our helplessness. Interestingly enough, the helplessness was a part of the theological position, right? Where that's the whole point of being fallen, like, the total depravity and this understanding of needing grace to pierce through that, to sort of bring us into a higher sort of more spiritual understanding of things. But anyways, the point of the matter is that now one could argue that we don't choose determinism. Maybe we just like to be in our own sense of freedom, right? But our sense of freedom is always kind of tethered to some sort of determinism, right? Our wants, our desires, what we think is success, all of these things are often like parts of the things that determine what we end up choosing in our freedom, right? So it's always kind of a mixture. But what I want to ask about is like, this isn't the right question, but there's a way in which it makes me wonder then, like, is that reaction of that made me feel so determined, so I'm just going to choose sort of a freedom to be able to do what I want and not really think about like what that sort of determines me to go to or be or whatever. Is that like more accurate? Like, is there a sense in which that's a fair reaction, or is that kind of a necessary potential process to sort of get to the place of realizing, oh wait, it is a mixture of determinism and freedom. But if I don't have some sort of third dimension, whether that's like the transcendental spiritual or God, then it ends up being in my own sort of calculus. And I don't know how to have I don't know how to have a proper mixture of the determination and the freedom, because it's, what's up, baby? You want chips? Okay, yeah, I'll get you some chips. So you know what I'm saying? Like I that was kind of a little bit fragmented there, but I guess I'm just interested in this idea of like the fact that, like, in a way it was kind of nice, because God, if even if the person's sort of like reactionary, resentful to God and that higher order of like, hey, you know, that made me feel so determined, then it's like God's like, yeah, that's totally fine. Then you can, then it's, in a sense, there's an ability to give people the freedom to choose that what is determined. You like which one is the one that's like which one is freedom and which one is determinism. We in a sense have, like, we maybe don't realize it, but in a sense, even in having certain phenomenological experiences, we have certain reactions, and those then seem to factor into our determination of what is determination and what is freedom. So okay, I'm gonna leave it there. Sorry,
I think what you're getting at is very important. I mean, you know, so often in life, the game is to figure out what you have control of and what you don't have control of, right? To choose your determinism, to choose your determinations. And if you don't, you can go nuts because you try to change things you can't change. And then you might not try to change things you can change. And this is what it seems to be like the human being. It's the art of choosing determinism is where freedom is found. You find your freedom in knowing how to choose what determines you and what doesn't. And so that's why doctrines of like freedom that are too much on the side of total freedom are too blunt to be useful. Determinism is too blunt to be useful. It's something about choosing determinism that is critical. Now, what's tricky, though, is the larger the social order, the more complex, the more it seems difficult for it to be able to, in a nuanced, sophisticated, and wise way, choose determinism, because it has to do what? It has to use law. And law is a very blunt weapon. You know, there will be distinctions between law and culture. Culture is less blunt, but it still creates right and wrong without being as blunt as law. So society tries to create different tiers of force to deal with the problem of choosing determinism and leaving people open to choose their determinations. But then, of course, the more the system is centralized, or the bigger the law system is, the more it's probably going to err on the side of too much determinism and not enough freedom. And then, of course, if there's something existential about human beings that actually don't like freedom, then we might actually like having too much determinism on the social order, which then, of course, would habituate us to not make choices. And then if there's something about choices that is necessary for the human to be human, being trained out of making choices could be very consequential. So I like this notion of being human having something to do with the art of choosing determinism, if you will, choosing, you know, for Hegel, he'd say determinations and different things. Well, let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, please.
I like what you said, Daniel, because like I was thinking, my thought was following the same path. I was like, I mean, Luther says something very great too, where he says, like, you know, the real freedom is just sort of the awareness that you're not free, right? So there's this, there's a bunch of different conceptions that we can give, but I think fundamentally the error with freedom is that most of us have a certain representation of what that means, and determinism uses whatever that representation of freedom as its premise, which is already problematic in itself. And, you know, they never concluded to the fact of like, well, maybe we should rethink what that means. You know, they never did that challenge, or they never did the sociological move where you do reverse causation. It's like, oh, well, actually, is it because we're free that we're determined? You know? And I also think Derrida does a really good job of, you could say, maybe even deconstructing causality when you really think about it. Because he says, you know, there's nothing that necessarily implies that the phonetic enunciation needs to correspond with the thing that you're referring to, right? Doesn't have to correspond. So if we take that seriously, you know, none of these things have to correspond of whatever science deems as causality. But, you know, I think they get themselves in a little bit of a trap, because if they're saying that we're determined by forces that exceed our own calculation and exceed our complexity of understanding, Well, then it gets hard to say it's causality, isn't it? Right? Because you have to really know what causes it. And if there is so many unknown causalities, so many forces that supposedly determine, it sort of refutes itself into this open thing where all we can say is that the subject is the subject that knows nothing, which can be ironically also the very place of our own freedom. I do very much like Paul's kind of, he goes like kind of like on a tangent about like in the Bible, you know, about like he wants to do good and then he keeps never doing it right. And, you know, he's like, I really do want to do good, but I just end up doing the opposite thing, you know? So, I mean, sure, there can be those things, but I think it does kind of come back to this concept of like attention, and this notion of the unconscious. But even then, I really do agree with like Iris Murdoch's kind of ethics on attention. It's like we confine our lines of moral action in time, but if you just gave it a little bit more room, it would change, right? It would change. You would. She gives this wonderful example about a mother that has bad intentions against a daughter-in-law, and she says that, look, on the exterior level, the mother is treating her nice, kind, doing the same actions, right? Now you could say that she has bad intentions, but you see, the thing is, as she pays attention to the daughter-in-law, the mother starts realizing, oh, she's not so bad. But she keeps up the same action. She keeps up the same politeness, the same gratitude, the same thankfulness. So Iris Murdoch does a really interesting kind of like challenge to this idea of intention, which a lot of the ethical realm is kind of obsessed with, but she challenged it through this idea of attention and time, right? That you're cutting it off too quickly, right? Cutting off too quickly, judging this action in time. And then that's another thing. But again, philosophical conversations about judgments in time is something that the society generally just isn't interested in, right? The only time that it gets interested is when we go, oops, we kind of fucked up. We should probably do a retrial. We should probably put this guy on stand again and look at the evidence again, because it seems like we kind of messed up. That's the only time. So there's this other element of time that comes into the issue. But then when you really take eternity or infinity, I don't want to be like, you know, I know people make distinctions between those terms, but if we take it, you know, eternity into real serious consideration, there's a real sense, the way Iris Murdoch puts about it, is like the good is for nothing, right? The good is for nothing. It sort of dissipates in itself in that face of eternity, in that face of, you know, so I mean, in some sense, the Christian sense, or a lot of many religious senses, kind of have this idea of just like, look, this is why we preach humility. This is why we strive against pride. And I know determinism is trying to make room for the impossible. Of course, the only problem that they did not anticipate was the fact that once people believe in it, they do the opposite.
No, I'll give it to Jacob Kishere. You know, I think what you said is very important. What I would, you know, I've been using it. We've been talking about this in the Ivan Illich stuff. All point ethics or algebraic ethics is very problematic. It must be multifaceted or geometrical or situational. Like the moment you say ethics is intention, not action, or action, not intention, well, you're trying to find an autonomous point to locate the kind of the core of ethical life. That's what gets you in trouble. It has to be the discernment of all of the dimensions together in concert, but that's hard. And we'd have to have judgment and know how to do that. Well, that's hard. So let's just make it intention. That's easy, because then it's, because the thing I was going to say earlier is we have to do everything in our power to fight autonomous everything. Like we have to stay in the bothness, the dialectical, the moving between. But our brains want to save energy. So our brains love the autonomous because it's easier to think. And we have to resist our frenemy brains to stay in the place of the tension. And if we're out of the tension, then we can't really make very good judgments because we're going to be judging ethics from a point, not from a whole situation or a multifaceted variable. So the point's very well put. And the problem is that law, like when ethics becomes just law by definition is not temporal. It is non-contingent. It is always wrong to do X and Y. And so when you get a society that is overly reliant on law because it's not able to ethically reason well, maybe because it's too algebraic per se and not geometrical enough, like Leibniz, then you got a lot of trouble. And what we're trying to do now that hopefully comes out in belonging again is we're trying to have law do the work of culture, and it cannot. Law certainly influences culture. It certainly teaches people different things, but it's not the same as culture. But honestly, culture is scary because people have to make active inferences and decisions in it. So Miss Murdoch is quite lovely. The last thing I was going to say, and then I'll give it to Mr. Kishere, I wonder if one of the reasons this concept of choosing determinism is so difficult is because we don't have religious conversion. Because a religious conversion is a choosing of determinism. I'm going to choose the worst of God and be determined by God, right? So it's kind of like, it's very interesting because the religious conversion, when that's robust in your society, kind of screams of a action that's not reducible to calculation by people who don't follow the same premises. And you're literally choosing to then live according to things that are outside of your determination. And when you don't have this kind of like active thinking of religious conversion, and certainly like, yeah, you can have everyone be around you a Christian, but that's not actually religious conversion. It's more like everyone grew up Christian. It looks like conversion, but it's actually not the same radical choice of freedom versus like converting in a context where no one is Christian. And it's almost like it's harder for us to think about choosing determinism when we don't have things like religious conversions, which is actively choosing a discipline. Because now what you can do is you say, oh, I'm going to choose to be a coder. Yeah, but you're only doing that because you got to get a paycheck. Right? Like it is a choosing determinism, but it's easier to rationalize as determined because you had to choose some occupation. And you could make the argument that religion has a similar thing, but there is something about the religion that is easier to see as a metaphysical determination that you are choosing. So it might be more difficult to think this choosing of determinism when you don't have religious conversion as a robust category in your society. Something I was thinking about, but let me give it to Mr. Jacob Kishere. Mr. Kishere, please.
Some really wonderful points in this last round. Just now what you touched on, Daniel, is really fascinating because it speaks to an inversion in our society where we have abundant individual freedom, but it's not particularly disciplined, devoted to, or determined by something greater. And so it ends up being not necessarily that free and probably quite shaped and determined by a whole variety of forces, the market included. And then in the opposite direction, you have this move into devotion, surrender, determinism that's kind of paradoxically produces more freedom. So that's just trippy and interesting. And this notion from Javier that the nature of the sin is contextualized by the timeline. The nature of what needs forgiving is determined by timeline. So if you can extend that horizon sufficiently long, something bad happens that produces an almost good 40 years later, then that actually brings about a different condition for relating to it. But I think the challenge in that would be how to extend that timeline beyond the horizon of what you can presently experience. I think for me, what's been brought up at core in this conversation is this theological sense that the relationship to God, the qualities of Christianity and other spiritualities that I have come into in the course of my life have not included what is a core tenet of traditional Christianity, Abrahamic religion, and Islam, which is God as judge, and the judge aspect and the judgment day aspect being there. And so in that way, you kind of end up with like the Christ forgiving side of it, but not the judge side. And then the question becomes, well, is that judge just like God as judge, prophet as judge, judgment day as eschatological? Is that just free-floating historical stuff, or is that actually some sort of expression of human nature? Because if it is an expression of human nature, then what's actually quite likely to happen is then what happens? I will take on the responsibility to hold the judgment, right? And therefore, in the act of forgiveness, the trespassing is just gone away completely. There's no sense of a justice in reality, which one could then render unto whatever quarrel or issue at hand. So that's just interesting for me. And I think it also speaks to a broader phenomenon. We're not really comfortable with God as the judge. But then when you get in a sticky situation, then all of a sudden you realize, oh, that God as judge is right there inside of me. That Abrahamic God is just deep in the psyche, ready to be awakened. So yeah, I'm still playing with this, and I find it very hard to how to integrate and situate that with the relationship to God that I have. So I think it would be really helpful to actually encounter some different maps, heuristics, and ways of playing with how to kind of translate what that is in a way that I can understand and fit it in with the reality as I understand it.
No, I love all that. I think one of the great mistakes is Christians speak about judge and grace as if this is the age of grace without judgment. And the issue is that law entails a grace. That's very important. So, for example, when you're in a society where you're surrounded by enemies, it's chaos, there's no like intelligibility to reality, but then suddenly all the people around you start following the same law, then you have a sense of understanding what your neighbor is going to be, and you don't have to be afraid all the time. Likewise, like in Javier Rivera, good to see you, sir. And likewise too, when law, like there'll be all these poems and different writing where like people praise the law and it's sweet because it brings intelligibility to reality. You know, instead of all these kind of chaotic phenomena where you don't know what the people around you are going to do, now there's some sort of standard of intelligibility according to which everyone can follow. Likewise, you no longer have to take justice into your own hands. You've been freed because now there's a law that takes justice into its hands, and now God's going to do it. Furthermore, we always got to see, like, there's grace in the Old Testament. When God said, you know, when somebody takes out your eye, don't kill them, just take out their eye, right? Like there's a grace in that. And then that develops into Jesus. And so the kind of idea is that law is actually a form of grace until it overfits. And it doesn't make place for the human element. And that's where the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Jesus shows up and he's like, you've turned the law in, you've separated law from grace. Now it's become poison. You've separated love from judgment. Now it's become destructive. And so what you've done is you now have autonomous law or autonomous judgment as opposed to a dialectic between law and grace, where law is the point of law and the point of judgment is to increase love in grace, not to simply be cruel. Right? And you see the other thing too, what's so interesting is like doctrines of, say, hell in Christianity are very, very unpopular in first world nations, middle class communities and things like that. But when you get into third world nations that are dealing with horrible things happening in their neighborhoods, or people are attacked, Boko Haram, or all these different things, suddenly the gnosis of justice actually creates hope. Because this world isn't a cruel place where my family can be killed and massacred, and at the end of the day, the evil wins. Actually, God in the end will set his creation right, and evil doesn't win at the end of the day. So there's a contextual element that also makes it more difficult to see how judgment can have love and grace on it relative to the condition that you are in, right? The other issue is that what has happened in, say, American Christianity is axioms have been turned into dogma, and then God's judgment is a reflection of dogmas. And that makes a lot of trouble as well. So for example, there are certain axioms of Christianity by which you live as a Christian according to. So let's say, for example, that God is Trinity. That's an axiom. That's a kind of basis of the intelligibility of your worldview, right? But if instead, and there are a few axioms, you could just throw out a creed if you wanted, like the Nicene Creed, right? But you see what ends up happening is gradually religion says, no, it's about dogmas. There are certain things that you have to do, or you're a bad Christian, or you're not a good person. And then the idea is, you mean to tell me that God's going to judge people relative to, if they break one of the laws of the church or not? Then it feels very, very unjust, right? But if instead we see what Christianity is mostly in the business of is, say, if you just take that as a religion, is there are certain axioms, and then God's judgment is against evil, not breaking the kind of dogmas that can feel very arbitrary or different things, then you can start to see how judgment is actually in service of good, not just in service of enforcing like various dogmas or things the church tells you is right or wrong. Like, so for example, some churches teach that technology is evil, right? Like using the internet is evil or different things, right? Well, then it's like, oh my gosh, you mean on Judgment Day, God's going to like punish me for using the internet? That's where judgment feels very silly. But if instead you say, no, God on Judgment Day is going to judge Boko Haram, that is torturing children or making children soldiers or different things, then you go, oh, well, that's great. That's a good thing, right? So the issue is it's harder to understand God's judgment as an expression of grace when most of religion is thought of primarily as dogmas, yes and no's, things you have to follow, as opposed to a situational logic to see how God is working out new creation in the kingdom that we see in Paul. Like if you see judgment in service of the kingdom work, that is the situational logic of Paul, as we've talked about sometimes in Wrestling Christianity, you get a very different impression of judgment versus the idea that there's a bunch of random dogmas that the church put forth, and if you don't follow them, then you're going to be punished by God. So I don't think it's by chance that this kind of dogma-heavy Christianity makes it very difficult to see how judgment cannot just be arbitrary and kind of cruel and different things. So it all kind of blurs together to cause various confusions. But let me pass it to Michelle here. Michelle, please.
Well, I thought that was really interesting, Daniel and Jacob, and I liked what Javier was sharing too. I really like this idea of thinking about Judgment Day in a different way, and it almost made me wonder, just playfully, to think about that. Where what if what if Judgment Day is almost more like our where we judge, like there's a way in which that it's almost like, what if there's an element of us judging who should be the judge of things, and like almost conceding to God's infinite understanding, infinite capacity, and our inability to do so. Because it's kind of interesting, like we often think about it so much in terms of it being like the harsh, capricious God or something like that, that's judging, just everything you got wrong. But there's almost a way in which we never think about it in terms of ourselves judging ourselves that harshly, and God saying, I've already forgiven you. It's as far as it is from the east is to the west. That's what I think of. When I think of you, I think about my child. So, I mean, I think about like the fact that maybe there's this element of like Judgment Day being, Judgment Day almost being like this idea of God saying, well, what do you think? And I don't know. I mean, that's just me being playful with that concept. But I do think that it is probably one of the most difficult things for people to grapple with, and often the largest stumbling block to people coming to faith, I think, is the concept of Judgment Day. And again, I think that that's just me kind of postulating about thinking outside of how we can dogmatically think about Judgment Day in terms of it being like some sort of, there's a way in which there's a reckoning that is violent and necessary and, in a way scary, but also a really, really important. But it's like, maybe there's a way in which part of that is like, maybe we can't conceive of how good judgment can be, in the sense of how freeing that would be for God to be the judge, where no longer it's on our minds to be like, do I know, or how could I know, or what do I think of myself? because a lot of times, especially if you have patterns of self-degradation, you're always gonna be like, I didn't do enough. I'm obviously a failure. I'm obviously like, I shouldn't really be deserved to be able to be in the presence of God. So I don't know. It's just a couple of scattered thoughts on the topic, but I think it's very interesting to think about again.
I think it's critical. I'll give it to Jacob. Judgment, you have to have a judgment day to be free of uncertainty. And how can you have heaven if you're not free of uncertainty, right? Like your whole life, you're wondering, did I do something wrong? And finally, God's going to be like, no, you're free. So that you can't have that freedom without a God who has transcendent knowledge to then judge what you think against what you think you're a terrible person and that you're not worthy of my love. You're wrong. Oh gosh, you're free. So judgment absolutely can have a grace. I think this topic, I'll give it to Jacob. The problem is we think about Judgment Day and we think a bunch of people are going to be surprised. Like a bunch of people who thought they were, it's like it's going to be like this kind of surprise idea is going to kind of come up. I question that. It's almost like it turns out, oh gosh, it turned out God had a different standard I didn't know about. I question that kind of narrative, but the linking of judgment and surprise has to be thought. But I'll give it to Jacob. I think this notion of judgment freeing you of uncertainty, because how could you have heaven if you're always uncertain? There's a final freeing of anxiety that can occur that I think is very important. But let me give it to Jacob and then Michelle. Jacob, please.
Yeah, I really appreciate that playful playing around with it. That was exactly what I was going for in a way. And I'm now thinking of like, can it be closer to correction than judgment, in the sense of like, if you have a maestro, if you have a maestro of some kind, they might correct you, and that is a form of judgment, right? But it's judgment in service of bringing you into alignment, and this also, like, in a way, it's about bringing together the judgment and the synthesis, the forgiveness coming into synthesis, such that they're actually sort of inseparable. And I think it keeps returning back to like, how much has our notion of God been projective, and therefore our notion of God's judgment been projective. And we've definitely invested that image with certain characteristics of the father figure, right? Of the patriarch. But then what's the ideal of that? What's the highest ideal of the patriarch? What's the highest ideal of the father? And it's not a pernicious judge. It's judgment in service of correction. It's judgment from a place of love. And then what does that even mean? What does that judgment look like? And how then does that transform the prospect of giving over judgment from oneself to that larger force, when the judgment is being recharacterized? Because it's almost like this, there's a interconnectedness between one's own interpretation of judgment and one's interpretation of God's judgment, and they both have to shift concurrently in order for that to be given over. Otherwise, you're just kind of like giving it, you're giving it to God, right? But it's still like you're holding God's judgment in the same framing of judgment that you already have yourself. So it doesn't have that quality of beyondness.
I love that comment. I'll give it to Michelle. I think there seems to be three categories of thought, and I do think it's biblically based, of judges, corrects, confirms. And we just use the term judge when actually there are different contexts by which that may manifest. But I'll expand on that. But let me give it to Michelle first. Michelle, please.
I thought that was really good, Jacob. And yeah, I think you're right about this idea that, there could also be a fear of like, oh, I know you're better than me, God, you know more than me, so I'll just hand over the judgment to you. I think that's at least that's what I kind of gathered that you were saying at the very end there, where it might not be that transformative, like maybe that there's a little bit more to kind of prod at there in terms of thinking about how this can kind of break our conceptions that we typically have that are so steeped in a lot of times just fear, honestly, about the nature of God. But there's this this makes me think a lot about parenting, and there is this, oh gee, I wish I could remember now. I'll have to send it to you guys later because I'm forgetting the exact translation now in Hebrew. But there's often that the verse about the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and so there's a lot of times this justification of that fear, like you should be afraid, versus the type of reverential, like the word is actually not as directly fear as it is some other word, and it has something to do with it's like the guidance of God or something like that. There's something more about this correcting that you're talking about, where there is a correcting, but it's absolutely done in love and connection. And I think about judgment, like the other thing that can be helpful for me is thinking about Judgment Day happening now, actually, like not just this like doom, like looming thing ahead that's sort of, that you have this sort of like angsty, fearful relationship with, of like this happening one day, and rather that in a sense, because in God's time, it's in a sense happening now already. Like, so how is judgment ontologically? How is Judgment Day ontologically every day, in a sense? And I think that is helpful for me to think about it in that way too, where we also take away the hyper moral sensibilities to the word judgment, where it's not so much about like the this I don't know why a Spanish word is coming to mind, but basically like heavy punishment or reward, but rather that it's actually just an assessment. Like it's like thinking about judgment more in terms of, it's like when they talk about unconscious parenting, where you do sports casting, where you just basically say, I see you're having a hard time with it, or I see you're crying because of this particular situation, or I see that you dropped your ice cream. It's not, that's the judgment. The judgment isn't a moralization. It's a observation. And it's a lot more about the judgment is to actually assess what is actually happening. That's the judgment, so you can actually situate yourself in where you are and what is actually going on for you. And in that way, understand a way to process and move through that, and acknowledge what's going on, and be able to ultimately get through that. And what gets you through that, but that core relationship that you have with your parents, with yourself, that informs your relationship with yourself, and also your relationship to God that informs your relationship with yourself. So anyways, I just think that's kind of interesting too, where there's a way in which it's so easy to think about, because fear is so addictive, and it's also very powerful, it's very consuming. Like, we don't think that we want to be afraid, but we tend to just happen to be controlled by fear so much that we don't even realize it. So there's something about it that we really have to do some deep work to sit with that and learn how to relinquish fear, so that we can have, I think, in a way, I do feel like that blocks so much a relationship with God because of fear. And it feels right, and it feels righteous, and it feels good. And in some ways it feels wrong to even question fearing God in that fearful way. And yet I do think there's a way in which, would you, like, if you had somebody who listened to you, but it's because they were afraid of you, how would that feel experientially? Would you really want somebody to listen to you just because they feared you? Or would you like them to listen to you, or listen to what you're saying because they cared about you, and they loved you, and they enjoyed you just as you enjoy them? So anyways, that's something that comes to mind too. Thanks for letting me. I know this background noise, but yeah, Eli.
No, I think that's right. Well, the problem is we use the word judgment to do too much. There's kind of three senses by which it is used in the Bible generally. There's judgment seems to punish evil, correct the misguided, and confirm the good. And judgment does all three of these things. And when you make that division, then it's always good, because it only punishes the evil, it only corrects the misguided, and it only confirms the good. But since judgment comes to mean punishment, and God judges everyone, that means God punishes everyone, right? But if you have those three senses, then you can start to see how actually it's a wonderful thing. Critically, there is also a metaphoric mistake in our understanding of Judgment Day. So the Bible, curiously, doesn't really talk. We get a notion at the end of time, there's God sitting on a throne, everyone's going to step in front of the throne, and God's going to look at his list and say, you were naughty or nice, not bad, come on in. That's kind of our metaphoric notion. Critically, the way the Bible is structured is more as if the very presence of God judges. Not because God actively judges you, but if God walks into your midst, it has a unveiling characteristic to it. And so the judgment is what follows from the presence. And let me explain what I mean by that. You find out the truth of someone when the real comes in, right? Lacan, or when stuff doesn't go their way. Let's say you thought you were going to have a certain, let's say your oven breaks. Does the oven judge you? Not in a kind of direct sense. But once it breaks, and it in a sense brings out the truth of you. Turns out you're kind of mean. Turns out you're not very patient. Turns out when stuff doesn't go like you planned it, you seem like a nice guy, but actually you're only nice if things go your way. When something happens unexpected, suddenly the truth comes out. And so what you see in the example of the broken oven or a flat tire on the car, there is a presence of an event that the judgment is the reaction of you to the event. How you react to the thing then brings out the judgment. It's not that the oven is directly judging you. It's that by it breaking, it brings something out of you. That's how it works with God. When God walks into the room, suddenly what comes out of you is the reality that you never believed in him. And now you're ashamed. And it's actually a kind of torture to you. Or comes out the reality that you always ignored that still small voice in favor of, say, material gains. God doesn't say anything, but you just experiencing the presence of God makes that reality very potent to you, right? Likewise, if you were just a straight up evil, rapist, terrible person, then when the foundation of the universe tears through the fabric of the cosmos and you're having to face it, and it turns out that you invested your life in the furthest thing from truth as you possibly could, that will be an absolute torture to you. And this is the key. The mechanism of judgment is the presence of God that makes you suffer the truth of yourself. So once you understand this, what you see when you think of God's judgment, what you think is like he has some like mysterious measure by which he's going to judge you according to, and you'll receive a proportional punishment to that. So it seems like mysterious and scary. But when you understand that what actually happens is God makes you face the reality of yourself by merely being present, then you see that the judgment is not like God arbitrarily punishing you. It's the sum of your own choices that then you can no longer plausibly deny. And if you say chose to follow God, well, then it's a bliss. It's a wonder, right? And so like we have to think of, it's in the same way that like if you run into a celebrity that you always adored, what will actually come out of you without the celebrity saying anything? If you had a kind of unhealthy relationship with the image of the celebrity, the way you act will unveil that, actually. The way you hold yourself will unveil that, actually. Like the very meeting of the celebrity then functions as a kind of unveiling or judgment of the quality of your relationship with the celebrity. And it turns out that you're a bit neurotic, actually. The celebrity didn't say anything. The celebrity didn't call you neurotic. But the meeting of the celebrity brought that about. Or you could meet the celebrity and find out that you're actually, treat them like a normal human being. And you don't think that they're special. And the reality comes out like, oh, you're not a slave to the idol of being a celebrity, actually. You have a healthy respect and understanding. But all of those dynamics come out in the presence of the celebrity. So that's what occurs with God. And the Bible speaks that way. That's the image, is that God comes, New Jerusalem comes to earth, God's in his presence. And the presence of God then creates people facing the dynamics that they cultivated according to their own life. And that's a very different metaphoric we need to get that metaphoric structure, and I'll give it to Jacob here, to understand judgment, because otherwise we have an image of God being like a judge sitting in a chair, and then we go before him, and he has some mysterious criteria that then we kind of go through, and we're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? That metaphoric structure is wrong. We have to think it about coming into his presence, like coming into the presence of a celebrity per se, and that having this reflective impact on ourselves. And that reflection will manifest evil as, if you're evil, the reflection will be a punishment. If you're misguided, the reflection will be a correction. And if you're quote unquote good, say by the blood of Christ, it will be a confirmation of that blood of Christ. So you have those three different ways to experience the reflection. And so I think metaphorically we have to shift it a bit, but let me give it to Jacob Kishere here. Jacob, please.
Yeah, really well laid out. Thank you. This conversation really feels like it addresses core questions for me. So philosophy in action. Well done, everybody. Yeah, what's coming for me is a helpful parallel, actually, in considering what's this quality of God's judgment that kind of separates wheat from chaff, confirms the good, distinguishes wrongdoing, and acts as a kind of revelatory mirror of all that is out of alignment. This is more or less precisely what the best ayahuasca, ibogaine, and other kind of very tough psychedelic stories tell you. People will say, ayahuasca showed me, or she, great mother, or what have you, she basically took me and showed me all of the times that I effed up, all of the times I was wrongdoing, and it's going through and it's taking you down into the shit. And so for me, the question that comes from that is almost to bring the judgment day to present day, entrusting in that. Well, I can entrust in God as the mysterious fabric woven through all of reality, but I can trust much more practically in something like plant medicine, right? I can trust that if somebody's on the path, then they will be exposed to whatever they need to be exposed to. And so too for myself, that I will be with whatever I need to be exposed to. And in that way, I think what that analogy really preserves is the sense with those plant medicines that they're acting with a wisdom. They're going to be tough, a tough grandmother or a tough grandfather figure, but they're ultimately kind of kicking your ass and cleansing you, purging you, making you pure, making you innocent on the other side of the loss of innocence, making you wise on the other side of foolishness, making you loving on the other side of seeing all of the ways that you are unloving. So this is a really helpful way for me to re-envision it.
I think that's a brilliant association. The judgment certainly, judgment metaphorically is better to associate with something like plant medicine than a courtroom. That is a far better metaphoric association. And in fact, there's some pretty good evidence that some early Christians used psychedelics as the Eucharist, actually. And that the Eucharist, the taking of the Eucharist, was a judgmental act because it unveiled, you're eating the body of Christ, so you have to descend into hell with him or ascend into heaven, right? Because this is the body of Christ, right? So this kind of the key is the other term that has been used is stuff like we talked about the other day, baptism by fire. Like the baptism of fire, that sounds pretty awful. You're being burned alive, but it's a baptism by fire. And the Holy Spirit is fire, but hell is fire. And it turns out the difference is your relation to it, which is only unveiled in the walking into it. You only find out your relation to fire by walking into it. That's how you find out if it's hell or the Holy Spirit. And so linking the judgment to a certain kind of mystical vision, that is critical. But you see, the problem is, because Christianity moved from axioms to dogmas, it metaphorically was then structured as a courtroom, and then judgment had to fall into a courtroom structure, and that has led to certain impressions of what judgment is that has been difficult. But if instead we say, no, Christianity is presenting axioms that then have to be put to the test, they have to be put through the fire to unveil their truth, well, then you see judgment is actually more like an experience. It's more like an experience. In the same way, like when you're a wrestler, what's Judgment Day? The tournament, going on the mat. There's, the doing of the thing is the judgment, right? So the judgment is the doing of Christianity. It's tied to experience. And then the ultimate judgment is tied to the experience of God coming through earth, ripping through the fabric of the cosmos and the recreation. So you have this ultimate judgment. That is what kind of this mystical vision of the whole cosmos the Bible is talking about. But then in addition to that, there's the daily judgment that Michelle was talking about, which is the testing of your Christianity in experiences that forces you to face it. Like when you go on the wrestling mat in a tournament, you must face the reality you didn't go to practice. That's how it works. When you go on the mat, then you face the reality that you did go to practice, right? The mat has a judgment in it. It must have a judgment, not because anyone is morally judging you, but because the mat in the tournament is the place that brings out the practice, the practicing. Likewise, the daily life is what brings out the practice and practicing of Christianity. So there's a daily judgment that is forcing you to face who you actually are in the doing it again. That's why the Bible also is like, be still, don't distract yourself. So then you can get a clear reading of what you're actually like. That is then pointing to a already not yet, as N.T. Wright would put it, ultimate judgment that is much closer to a certain experience of a presence than it is a courtroom. So the problem is we're just metaphorically messed up. Like we have the wrong we have the entirely wrong metaphoric schema to think about judgment that has really gotten us into trouble. And we need to think about judgment as an experience, as going out on the mat, as a mystical vision, as walking into fire to see our relationship to fire as hell or Holy Spirit. These are much better metaphorical structures that we've just kind of lost in the West.
Yeah, I'm sitting into that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Actually, I was thinking as we were talking, I think it ties to the church pilgrimage thing as well, because when church is separated from pilgrimage, then you go to church to be judged for your checkup on Sunday. Hey, were you moral this week? Hey, did you follow Christianity? Okay, check, you're ready. You got your judgment checkup, and you're going to be ready for Judgment Day, because every Sunday you go in to get your judgment checkup. But if instead church is the pilgrimage, well, that absolutely aligns with judgment being the experience, right? The experience of you going along, because what do you find out on the pilgrimage? That you don't like not eating food. It's like Mehun was talking about, right? Like on the pilgrimage, you find out that you're pretty irritable if you don't get water and food. The pilgrimage has a judgment in it. The pilgrimage brings out the truth of you, right? It brings it out in the doing of the pilgrimage. Whereas theoretically, you could go to church and no judgment come out because you just sit in a pew, do some worship songs and leave. So then what ends up happening is the pastor has to actively judge you because the building of church does not guarantee a judgment in the going to it, right? Whereas the pilgrimage does. That's the problem. When church becomes a building that doesn't in its structure have an unveiling part of the going to it, then someone has to get at the podium and actively carry out the moral assessment, if you will, or the assessment of the members. Where when you go on a pilgrimage, the pilgrimage itself in its experience brings out the truth of the people on the pilgrimage. So this is all connected, because like when we have church separate from pilgrimage, we can't understand judgment, because we metaphorically associate it with the pastor at the front of the room telling us if we did something right or wrong. But when we associate it with pilgrimage, well, the road itself brings out the reality of us. We don't need anyone to tell us. The difficulty of the task brings it out. So that's also contributed to this problem on judgment. But let me give it to Michelle here. Michelle, please.
That was all really great, Daniel and Jacob. I loved what you guys were both sharing. Thank you for that. And yeah, I think there's something really important about what you just said about this idea of like the fact that, you know, judgment, because I'm thinking about in John, I forget which particular scripture it is, but it talks about like all things will come into the light. Everything that's in the darkness will come into the light. So that's why it basically says like that's why people are doing things that are wrong, like to hide those things, because they don't want to be seen for what they've done. But in time, it you know, basically it doesn't say in time, but it says everything that has been done in the darkness will come to light. So for me, it's helpful to think about this from a psychoanalytical perspective. This isn't like, in a way, it's almost as if you have the opportunity to know yourself and to be known so that you can be loved. That's why the judgment is there. God is able to judge so that you can be fully known and fully loved. And I think that's important, because if God couldn't, if there was no element of judgment, what would that be mean? Like that wouldn't be meaningful in this new sense of judgment, not just the punishment and rewards, right? It's this, I made a judgment. I see that you've done these things. that's why it's important to have some judging capacity or facility of our brains, right? That's why we are made in the image of God, who is a judge, because we judge things. We judge things as we judge things as it's dark, it's light, it's, we're in a room, I'm not in a room, I'm outside, right? Like these are just core judgments of our perception and our reality. And I think there's something about the ability that God is judge to be able to say, I do see everything that you are and that you've done, and yet to be able to be so fully known and fully loved. There's something that's so radically, almost like unbelievable about that, that's the belief we have in the unbelievable. And the other thing I want to say is that, what I said about the passage from John and the psychoanalytical is that I wonder if judgment is just a feature of, if we have so much fear around it, we never allow ourselves to bring the things to light that we need to, that will be brought to light anyways. In a way, Judgment Day is almost like, do you want to delay that, or do you want to just understand that it's happening now? And that actually in your ability to bring to light in confession, in prayer, to be able to have these practices that then give us an ability to, that's fine, baby, yeah, that's fine. To have these practices that allow us to actually make a judgment about what we've done. We know what we've done, or we know what we've said, or we know what we've thought. Let's bring those to the light, because in that manner, we are allowing ourselves to make a proper judgment of what we are, and we allow others to make a proper judgment of who we are, not for the sake of condemnation, but for the sake of actually a fuller, more unconditional type of love. So anyways, I just wanted to say that really quick. And I know maybe that sounds too, but it's just, I really want to, I really am glad we're talking about this, because it does reveal too all of the kind of deep ingrained fears that come about with Judgment Day, of like, just this, you're getting put up there on the stand, and now you've got to answer for yourself. And that's what it is. I mean, scripturally, there might be even verses about that, like you have to give account of every idle word you said, or, you have to give account for yourself. But I think in a way, if we could think about this as more revelatory, right, where we have this revelatory understanding of who we are and why we've maybe done certain things, or how that's kind of caused, what sort of consequences that has had, is ultimately to get back to the connection of ourselves to ourselves, and not to be fragmented. We can't integrate if we never allow the darkness to come into the light, but also that integration with God himself and with others, to have that ultimate connection that is based on reality and the truth of that true judgment of who we really are, not for the sake of, again, condemnation, but for the sake of unconditional love. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Amen. Hallelujah. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't expecting you to come in with something quite moving and on point, but you did. And gosh, yeah, just the image of domestic heaven over there, cooking and philosophizing. So there you go. Yeah. What I really appreciate about this is the sense of like when you took it from more of a psychoanalytic perspective, it was like, it's like a penetrative non-judgment. It's like a non-judgmental light that's going to shine into all of the dark corners, all of the things that you're ashamed of, all the things that you would not want to present. And that is such a beautiful inversion and conversion of the meaning of judgment in relationship to forgiveness that I didn't think would be possible, except through the magic of Dialogos that we are witnessing here. So yeah, and I the sort of tertiary observation to that our we project a sense of the possibility of judgment by others in relationship to all of those things. And that's just kind of like under the surface in society, I think. And if you create the right kind of container, it's very easy to start to see that. I played a dialogue game recently where everybody was only allowed to speak when they felt resistance to speaking, and it was fascinating because it created this like psychological sauna, and almost everybody present said they had this feeling of like, oh, I feel like I'm gonna be like called out or persecuted or like, and like this stuff is just like right there under the surface if you create the right condition. And so this possibility of a forgiving, illuminating judgment as envisioned as the nature of God, and then potentially through that envisionment brought down into the community of believers, is a very encouraging prospect, because that's the only true medicine, I think, to those things that become shameful and pathological ultimately. And that's what fucking everybody's going to therapy for anyway. So
no, I think that's divine. Because it is funny that so much of therapy is like bringing out and speaking and actually speaking, and there's freedom that comes with that, but there's also difficulty. There can be hardship, and then you can start to see, oh wait, there is a kind of purgatory in freedom. There's a kind of purging that occurs, and you start seeing all this language in Christianity comes out, but it's the only road to freedom. And then you can see the wisdom of Dante going through Inferno, Purgatorio to get to the Paradiso, because you have to face that difficulty, but then you're free of it, right? And C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce is very good on that. I think also it's like you'll finally know yourself. Like you'll finally know. Like Socrates is like, know to thyself be true. It's like we don't know ourselves. We can't do it. And then when everything's in the light is like, yes, I know myself. And in that I'm free from those psychoanalytical burdens. Like I know I'm not defined by those things. Before judgment, you can't know that you're not defined by those things because everyone else told you you are defined by those things. And judgment from God can free you from those toxic associations and different things. I also, as we come up on the close here, and if anyone has final thoughts, please, I also think it's important to note that when the Bible is like, hey, you'll have to give an account of everything, unfortunately, very often we associate that with, did you follow the law or not? Did you follow the dogma or not? Really, it seems to be more like you'll have to give an account for how you used your time. Like, were you on the pilgrimage or not? Right? Like when we have this kind of idea of you're going to have to give an account of yourself, we hear that in like, oh, did I follow all the dogmas? But if instead we can associate it more so with, you'll have to give an account on your journey. Did you face the difficulty things? Did you go on the pilgrimage or not? Then it changes. You see, the problem is when our metaphoric structure is church, giving an account of yourself means, like, did you pass the test of the pastor, right? But if giving account of yourself is, did you go on the pilgrimage? Were you able to get over the obstacles? Were you able to face the difficulty? That's a very different thing. Likewise, if you go out on the wrestling mat and you lose the mat and the coach is like, why didn't you go to practice? You know, that's a very different giving an account of versus not following certain laws and principles. But again, we define everything by the metaphor of going to church, which has this kind of judgment structure. So giving an account of yourself feels like, did you follow all the rules, basically? When giving your account to the coach of why you didn't go to the practice is not really like following the rules, but it's a response to just the facticity of the reality of the match in the pilgrimage. So we can't understand what it means to give an account of ourselves if we don't have a doctrine of pilgrimage or journey or lifelong development. It becomes very, very difficult to understand that. And I think it's also important that Revelation ends with this idea of kind of a white rock, that judgment is finally learning your true name on the bottom of a white rock that only you and God will know. Like, this is the glory of when God shows up, you're actually going to gain your full identity and know that you don't have to define yourself by all the things that people told you were, the psychoanalytical traumas and burden. You're free of those things because those aren't you. This is you on the bottom of this right rock, which is a very important idea in Revelation. So I think we need to associate giving an account to ourselves with being responsible for our pilgrimage, for our journey, for our development. And you know, you're responsible for how you use your time, which of course, that changes everything. Because then Christianity that just wants to fit into consumer capitalism, and a good Christian, you know, you basically are a capitalist and you just go to church on Sunday. No, you're going to have to give an account of yourself. That's not going to do. That, like, why did you think that was Christian? Why did you think that was a pilgrimage? Why did you think that, John? Why did you think that, Joe? Because it's what everyone else was doing. Oh, really? So that's why you do it? And it's like, okay, I know the Bible didn't quite, and and it's not going to be like God going, gotcha, but it will be like the honest sort of questions that people, like a lover asks you, like, well, why'd you do that? In a kind of honest sort of giving an account of self. And God won't have to make you feel bad, because you'll make yourself feel bad simply by knowing that the account that you give is not adequate for what you claim to believe and for what you claim that you are going to live your life according to. Just simple, honest questions can bring out that reality. So I think we have to read the account stuff in light of that. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it to everyone for closing remarks, the whole freedom determinism thing is much more harder to understand in a church metaphor than a pilgrimage. Because, like, when you're on a pilgrimage, you know that there's a blurring between freedom and the unexpected and the determined. You're on the path and you run out of water because there's a hole in the bottle. Now you have to respond to it freely, right? Like a pilgrimage and a journey shows you that there is a kind of blending of freedom and determinism that goes on. But when you're in a church and the pastor says, do X or Y, then you are stimulated to that week, do X or Y, right? So there's a separation between the stimulant and the action that leads to a split between freedom and determinism, right? Likewise with the judgment, if there's kind of a courtroom where then you're judged later, the action, like the thing that you're responding to, is separate from the action of doing the thing. And that separates freedom and determinism. Where if you're on a journey, you're freely responding to things you didn't choose constantly. You're having to improv. You're having to have the skill to know what to do when the coyotes come or something like that, right? So a pilgrimage, metaphorically, is far better also for understanding the relationship between freedom and determinism. And then you couple that with a better understanding of judgment. You put all those things together because you have a better metaphoric complex, and we can start moving beyond some of the kind of traumatic thinking of judgment or the baggage thinking of judgment and associate it more with the road, really. Church has to like have a person to moralize, where a pilgrimage is a road that just brings out the truth. And so the road brings out the truth of you because it brings out the constant choice of how you're going to respond freely to things you didn't choose. And so that then becomes the kind of test that brings things out. And again, I'll pass it now. I think the pilgrimage is a much more healthy metaphoric structure by which to think through all of these issues. And it shows that metaphors do matter. Metaphors truly matter. They structure thought more than we realize. Neil Postman, Susan Sontag, I.A. Richards, all of them warn that. And I think the church, Christianity, would benefit a lot from working through problematic metaphoric schemas. But please, for closing remarks.
Absolutely. And Michelle says this whole talk has been fire. I'm inclined to agree. It's been very fiery. If anybody is interested in this talk on pilgrimage, which was also fire, that's going to be coming soon on SenseSpace. That's not up yet, but it's amazing. OG Rose, Ken Lowry, Malin McCann. Power of pilgrimage. Yeah. Today has really been a testament to this kind of theo-philosophical, highly generative work that is happening without anyone really directing us or paying us to do it. But simply by following what seems most interesting and important, we are arriving at it. And it seems like each week and each month that passes by, we are digging up these words and churning them and finding where the roots go, and in some ways like planting them in more healthy soil, like discovering the true liberating meaning in these words. And I feel we've done that today with judgment, and certainly there's more to come and more to go with judgment. But I've come across countless men in the last year who come from Catholic backgrounds and have really borne out the Catholic code, especially in relation to judgment, in a way that actually was running their psychology and affecting you know, their everyday experience and how they, you know, feel about various actions that they take. So it's really, really important that new potentialities are seated in this. And I'm grateful to be doing that with you. And gosh, it was one other thing, but I think I've just about lost it now. So yeah, I think I'll close my remarks there.
I agree with everything you said. Absolutely marvelous. I really like the theo philosophy, like you're saying. And again, the talk on pilgrimage, I really, really enjoyed. I love those guys. I love those talks
I remembered.
so much. Please go ahead.
Yeah, there was one tiny remark you made just there. It was like, as if from a lover, you said. It was like truth as if received from a lover, like being held to account as if by lover. And that was really interesting to think through, like, what's the quality of holding to account a judgment that you receive from, like, from your soulmate, from your spouse, when you're like getting down to like the deep truths of the shit you've both done in your lives, kind of thing. Like that's a really interesting way of doing it, because that's an instantiation of, you want to know this person truly, but you want to know them in love, and that's how God wants to know us. So yeah, it's a good potential to play with that.
Absolutely. No, I think because it's so interesting in a love relationship when somebody asks you a question, because there's a way questions are often used as weapons. And then there's another way where questions are asked genuinely. And because they're genuine, they're all the more powerful in bringing out the truth of yourself to yourself. And that's kind of the quality that only love is capable of, actually. And so that's the kind of, if God is love, then God is, you know, the ultimate love, then logically it would follow that God is the only being who can ask that kind of question at its highest quality. And that is then the high quality question that is the judgment in love, for the relationship. So the truth can come out and then the relationship be all the better. But only God would be capable of asking that kind of question in the highest quality. But everyone, this has been a treat. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure.